Well, I hope everyone has had a good day. Definitely tell we're in the supposed winter time frame because it's already dark outside. Notice how I said supposed because it doesn't feel like winter outside. But that's okay. We'll get through it anyway. I want us to think about something this evening, and I want us to think about Jesus for just a moment, and the fact that the Bible records him weeping. And I want us to think about what that means. What does that entail, and why? And we're going to look at a couple of areas this evening about just that and the understanding of him. And we've got the title as The Tears of Jesus. And if you'll remember in John chapter 1, we're going to use this as our springboard into the main part of the lesson. John chapter 1, Jesus gets word that Lazarus has died. And he gets word first that he's sick. And it says he waited. And finally he gets the word that he's died. And he says, okay, let's go. And I've always thought it is so amazing to think about the fact and understanding that Jesus waited. There was a purpose behind what was going on. There is a purpose behind why Jesus held off going. He could have been there and raised and healed Lazarus before Lazarus died. He could have done a lot of different things for Lazarus before. He didn't even actually have to be there. He could have healed him before he even got there. Because there's so many different locations that we read of. The centurion's servant that happened to be healed. Jesus wasn't in the centurion's house, but he was healed because of the faith that the centurion had. You know, that just shows us that Jesus has the ability of doing a lot of things that I think we don't consider. And a lot of people don't take into consideration or into mind as they look at Christ. Christ has the ability to heal all wounds. Isn't that an amazing thought to think about? He has the ability to heal all wounds. As you progress through the chapter in chapter 11 and you get to where Jesus has come up and he's met by his sister, and his sister is really in distress. She's just kind of, you ever been to that person that just lost a loved one and they're lashing out at people because of the hurt of losing that loved one? They just lash out at them. Their anger is kind of centered on the individual that they're talking to rather than on the situation. I kind of see that take place. And her statement kind of probably should have stung and probably would have stung most people. If you had been here, he would not have died. He goes to the tomb. He's taken after asking. He gets to the tomb. And there's a statement made at this tomb that is so powerful and so amazing to me. Because he says, open it up. And they're like, he's been dead for 4 days. We don't need to do this. And do it. And they open up the tomb and he says, Lazarus, come forth. I don't know if you've ever pictured this scene, but Lazarus was still wrapped in his death garments. So I've kind of pictured him walking out kind of like a mummy, wrapped in these death garments that he would have been wrapped in. Because remember, the next words Jesus says is, loose him and let him free. But there's a statement in all of this. By the way, it also needs to be said, if you look at verse 45, which is actually where I say to go through, that the Pharisees no longer sought just to kill Jesus at this point. They sought to kill Lazarus also. That's important. Because their idea is if we can get rid of what he did, then we can get the people to see us again. And that's the idea that they're looking at. They're not concerned about what Jesus is doing. There's a whole purpose behind Lazarus' death. There's a whole purpose behind Lazarus' resurrection. And that purpose is to be and to see the will that God has set forth for us. But there is a small verse, verse 35, that says a multitude of words in just two. Jesus wept. Why? Why did Jesus weep? Did he weep because of the non-belief of the ones that were so close to him? Did he weep because he knew that no matter the fact that he was about to bring forth Lazarus, that there were those that wouldn't believe him or in him? Did he weep because he was taking Lazarus out of the best place ever compared to this earth and bringing him back into a sorrowful, sinful world? The Bible doesn't tell us why he wept to that extent. But I'm almost certain that there is sin underlining a lot of the problem of what takes place with Lazarus' resurrection. Maybe Jesus saw what they were going to try to do to Lazarus, and he had already been through it himself. They'd already tried to kill him a couple of times. Maybe that's what he's thinking. There's a lot of different things that we could speculate on why he wept. But the words themselves are powerful. The words themselves are amazing. You see, here's why. Jesus wept at the grave of a friend. Lazarus was his friend, dear friend. He was close. And Jesus hears the news of the death of Lazarus. And he doesn't go right away, as we've already said. He holds off. There's purpose behind this. There's reasoning. And it all has to do with the power of God and what God can do. Because what we see in Lazarus' resurrection is we see the power of God. Because the grave cannot hold God. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul writes as he's discussing the same idea about the resurrection. He says the same thing about Christ. It was because of Christ's overcoming of the grave and over death that gives us victory in Jesus. We do not have to worry about the death. We do not have to worry about the grave because Jesus has overcome it. And if we are in him, we have overcome those two as well. The greatest enemies of man are death and the grave. Because those are final. You can't come back from that. They're final. I know I've heard of stories where individuals have been in the ER and after being dead for so many minutes, they revived them. Let me tell you this. If that person had been in the grave, they weren't coming back. But yet, Lazarus is brought back. We see the power of God once again over the grave and over death. Martha questioned him. And why? Well, let's just be upfront with it. We would have questioned, would we have not? Knowing Jesus could have kept him from dying, and yet he allowed him to die? We would have questioned it, right? To say we wouldn't takes away the humanity that you and I have. Because I can answer that question on my side. In the year leading up to my mother's death, I knew God could heal her. And I prayed for God to heal her. And I didn't see her getting better. And I asked God multiple times, Why? Why can't she get better? And some will say, oh, well, you just don't understand. God doesn't. Look, when you're in that type of a situation, I hear people all the time, don't let your faith waver. Don't go against God. I didn't go against God. I didn't waver against my faith in God. I knew who God was. I believed in what God had given me. I believed it. I questioned my faith to me. I questioned where I stood. What was I doing? Because as Jack pointed out in our adult class this morning, we read in the scriptures that says, ask and you shall receive, because we misunderstand what's being said there. And we read in other areas that if you ask in a faithful manner, God is faithful to request. And yet we sit here and we say, and so I was questioning, am I being faithful to God in the way I'm living, that He would not answer this prayer? I understand why Martha's questioning. But sometimes we need to step back and we need to look at the situation and we need to say, you know what? We don't understand, number one, God completely. We never will. Not until we're face to face with Him. But number two, we don't necessarily know the plans of God. Did God allow my mom to die? No, cancer took my mom because of sin. I know that. You see, when we step back and we examine a lot of things, we'll see that the one we blame, usually God, is not the one at fault. But that's who gets the blame, just as Jesus did by Martha. Jesus didn't cause Lazarus to die. Jesus didn't cause Lazarus to get sick. But yet He got blamed for it. Why did He weep? Again, I've already mentioned that. There's a variety of different speculations. The Bible says He wept. Me personally, Dennis's opinion, I want to put that out. Dennis's opinion doesn't amount to much. But I've always believed that it hurt him to know that he was having to bring his friend away from the security his friend already had and have to face the trials he was about to have to face again. Not necessarily of this life, but of the Pharisees, because of what they were going to do. Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 44, we find that Jesus wept over a city, an entire city. Destruction comes when people are blind to what's going on around them. I can use that for quite a bit in a variety of things. I hear everybody, and somebody will say, oh, well, you're very callous about this situation. But I'm sorry. How many of us have been to New Orleans? How many of you seen the ships above you as you're in New Orleans? What does that tell you? That tells you you're in a bowl. In fact, they call it a soup bowl, because that's what New Orleans is in. And yet when catastrophe comes up, notice this again, when the destruction of Katrina hit New Orleans, God got the blame. Why did God allow this? And my question I had is, why did we build there? If we knew it was going to be unsafe, oh, I didn't know it was going to be unsafe. You can't see the barges going by you every day above your head, and you don't see the danger? It's because we're blind to what's going on around us. We're blind when we look around and we don't see the dangers of the sinful nation that we live in because they refuse to repent and they refuse to follow the will of God. We're blind. I was talking to some people the other day and I said, something really blew my mind. It may have been here. I may have said this to y'all Wednesday night. I don't remember. Short memory, I guess. But I was talking about the fact that, when I was in the Marines, hearing people curse all the time was nothing. I got used to hearing it. It didn't bother me. I didn't remember. I didn't notice it. But now when I'm standing there after being away from it for so long and I hear it, I'm shocked. Why? Because I took myself out of an environment that blinded me to an environment. And I surrounded myself with an environment that's better. Look at our society. Our society calls what God says unnatural, natural. Our society says it's okay for men and women to step out and cheat on their spouse. Our society says it's okay for our young people to do whatever they want to with their bodies. It doesn't matter. You just do what feels good. It's because we're blind to what's going on around us. And that's what causes destruction. That's when problems ensue. And that's when sin takes over so much. Let me ask you this. When we go to funerals, do we weep over the loss of the individual? I think I can say yes to most of that. We may not necessarily weep over the individual at a funeral because we may not have known the individual, but we're there to support another person. And it brings into memory some others that we have sat in that we have mourned. But more importantly, do we mourn over the loss? Maybe I should say lost and put a T there. Those that don't know the way, do we mourn over them and try to help them and try to bring them back into the way that they need? There's another area we find where Jesus wept. Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46. We find that Jesus wept in the garden. The night in which he was betrayed, he wept. What an amazing thought. Luke 22, verse 44 gives us insight. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7 gives us insight. Why was Jesus weeping in the garden? Well, let's be honest with ourselves. Jesus did not want to go through what he was about to go through in a physical sense. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. But not me. Let it be your will. He didn't want to face it, but he knew he had to. You see, all of these instances that we just looked at, there's something in common. And it's not that Jesus wept. It's the sinfulness of man. It's the sin that is within us. And so as we look at the reaction Jesus had in these situations, it causes me to ask about the reactions to sin that you and I need to have. And in this case, we see that Jesus wept. He would weep over the fact of the sin that was in the lives of people. His reaction to sin? Weeping. Man has a reaction to sin. You ever noticed it? Let's ignore it. Maybe it'll go away. Have you ever tried to ignore an infection? Did it just go away, or did you have to get help with it? I hate to say this, but when we ignore an infection, you know what happens? It gets worse. You know what happens when we ignore sin? Look at our society, it gets worse. You know, I hear people all the time say some things, and one of those things that I hear them say is, to the extent of, oh, I just don't see how it could get any worse. Well, read your New Testament and look at the society that the New Testament church was formed in, because it can get a lot worse. Because the government of Rome was one of the most vile and wicked nations. And yet that was the rulers of the area that Jesus walked and that the church grew in. Man would ignore sin. Today, man ignores it. Oh, well, that's whatever they want to do, just let them do it. We need to realize there are consequences to that. However, Paul has some answers. Paul's answers to the reaction to sin, not worthy to be called an apostle. That's how Paul felt. You can find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 9. Paul did not feel like he was worthy to be called an apostle because he knew he had sin in his life. And he had weakness. And he had issues. And he had problems. And he would go to God. And he would talk to God. No, it didn't change who Paul was. Paul didn't allow that, even though he knew he had sin, he did not allow it to bring him down to where he did not do the will that God had set forth for him. He struggled through it, and he continued on. He called himself the least of saints, according to Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 8. This is the man that wrote the majority of the New Testament. And he considered himself least of the saints. He called himself the chief of sinners, according to 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15. Why would Paul have this type of reaction? Because Paul would examine himself daily. And he would see where he was and where he needed to be. And even though he didn't necessarily see himself match up to the Word of God every day in his life, he still would strive to. He would try to adjust that compass so that he could be heading in the right direction the way he needed to. He would do what needed to be done so that he did not wander away. And he did not make shipwreck. And he did not lose the fight. We look at Paul and we say, what a great man he was. If I could only be just a fraction of as good as Paul was. Newsflash, Paul was like you and I. You are a fraction of it. So we can't use that as an excuse. We have to examine ourselves. We have to make sure that we're matching up to the will of God, no matter what's going on. No matter how bad things seem, no matter how sinful the world looks, you and I must continue on. Why? Because we are carrying the flag of Christ. You and I are His warriors. And you and I can overcome. So let me ask you this. Where are you right now? Do you need to get right? By becoming a Christian or by coming back to Christ because you're not living as a Christian? Will you let us help? Will you do something about it? Will you step out and come forward right now? While together we stand and sing this invitation song.